Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Cooking with Colbath. My name is Julie Colbath. I'm the coordinator of Civic Engagement in the Office of Student Life here at UM-Dearborn. Thank you so much for joining. I was trying to decide what to make today and I had a craving for pizza that I haven't been able to shake. And so I had found this recipe for no yeast pizza dough, which seems pretty simple and pretty quick, right? A lot of the times when you make pizza dough with yeast, you have to let it rise, which has a lot of benefits to it, don't get me wrong, but sometimes you just want something quick and easy, and you might not have yeast at home, or I remember last year around this time it was really hard to find. So this recipe is really basic, and it calls for flour, baking powder, salt, olive oil, but you could use like I have avocado oil, or you could use vegetable oil, and water. So pretty simple. We do have to let it rest for like 5 minutes. So we'll mix it together, and then we'll let it sit for a few minutes. We'll kind of talk about the differences between yeast dough and non-yeast dough, and then we'll get it going. The first thing we're going to do though is preheat our oven. So I'm going to turn it on 425. Cool. Alright. So now we are going to stir together our flour, baking powder, and salt. So I'm going to grab a little whisk. And if you don't have a whisk, you could use a fork or a spoon, no big deal. So we have all-purpose flour. I don't know if you are gluten-free, if you try to do it with like a 1-to-1 flour, I don't know how well it would work, just as a heads up. So we're going to add some salt to our flour. Sorry, I don't have a clear bowl. They're all in use with my watermelon today. Baking powder. And that'll sort of act like similar to yeast, I think, in some ways, and help get some air pockets. We're just going to whisk this together so it's evenly mixed. Okay. And then we are going to add the olive oil to the water. So again, this is avocado oil. If you have vegetable oil, canola oil, that should work too. I don't really need to mix it because it's not going to mix well. And then we're going to pour them into, sorry, I'm trying to read my computer from afar, the bowl with our flour until a shaggy ball of dough forms and no more dry flour remains in the bowl. So I'm just adding it all. And I'm going to mix it with my whisk. You could also just use your hands, because sometimes, right, it starts to clump in the whisk, which is not always the most fun. So let's just get that out. I saw this thing, like a whisk tool to get all of the stuff out of your whisk. Seems like it might be useful. Where you would just put it over and then drag it, and then everything will come out of your whisk. Okay. I'll just set that aside. I'm just going to start mixing it with my hands. That way it mixes a little bit easier, right? So it's starting to form a dough, a ball, but it's still a little bit wet because it's not fully incorporated. If you find your dough gets to be too wet, you can add more flour. If it's too dry, you can add more water. Alright, so it's definitely, right, is forming some sort of ball. Don't necessarily know what the definition of a shaggy ball of dough is, but I'm going to add just a tad more flour because it feels really wet to me. So I've got container of flour over here. This is a half cup. It's not full. I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit more in. Set that aside. And then just fold it in, again, sort of like knead it in the bowl. And it still feels a little bit too wet, so I'm just going to add the rest of what I have there. And hope that this helps solidify it a little bit more. Alright, it's already looking better. I'm just continuing to mix it around in my bowl to scoop up all of the flour that's in there. And I think that should be good. I'm going to try to get as much as I can off the sides so that when we take it out, it's easier. I'm going to try to get as much as I can off my hands. So I'm just going to throw it right back in the bowl. And then we'll just let this sit for 5 minutes. Alright, so I'm going to set a timer quick. Don't get into my dirty hands. Okay. So first off, we actually need to take it out and turn it on a lightly floured surface. So that was my bad. So I have more flour. I'm just going to do it right here on my little island. So I just sprinkle some flour, and we're gonna knead it a few times in the flour. And so this will also help it solidify a little bit more. And so I think this is what you get for not fully reading the directions beforehand, but a lot of the times when you're making dough with yeast, you just leave it in the bowl to let it rise, and so that's why I was leaving it. So we're just gonna kind of knead it a little bit. I'm trying to get it in a little bit more flour so it makes more of a ball and stops sticking so much to my hands. You could also flour your hands, right? That might help a little bit too. So I'm going to get a little bit more flour. And just put some on my hands. There's already dough on there, but at least this will help a little bit. And so we'll just continue to knead it a little bit. And then we'll let it rest. It does feel a little bit wet, so if you're doing this at home, maybe add a little bit less water at first, just so that you don't have to compensate with as much flour. It will make a difference if you're using like all-purpose or wheat flour as to how it turns out, because they all cook a little bit differently. So it's not like a super great looking ball of dough, but I think it'll be fine. I don't think it needs to be perfect. So I'm going to try to get as much off my hands as I can, and then we'll set the timer for 5 minutes. So I set the timer for 5 minutes. I'm going to continue to get a little bit of this off my hands, and then I'm going to wash my hands, and then we'll sort of talk about what the difference is between like a no yeast dough and a yeast dough. Okay, a little bit difficult to get off your hands. I mean, with water it comes off easy, right, but it's still a little bit sticky. So I was reading and it was interesting on the website to see this. Let's see. So, the no yeast pizza dough, the website says it's not exactly like traditional pizza dough that's made with yeast. So it doesn't go through a lot of kneading and rising. So it has a softer, fluffier, less chewy, and more bread-like texture. And it's not super crispy. It doesn't make those like bubbles on the edges, and it doesn't get very brown. And this is kind of comparing it to old school Domino's crust before they sort of changed up their recipe, or like thicker crust frozen pizzas. So instead of like gas bubbles that are produced by the yeast, the dough rises through gas bubbles produced by the baking powder, which requires both water and heat to react. So that's why we won't see anything rising, because it sits at room temperature. So it's really once it gets into the oven that it starts to like get those gas bubbles forming. So you can either use a rolling pin or just hand stretch the dough. Seems like rolling pin is potentially easier, but it creates a more dense baked crust. And so if you are able to stretch the dough by hand, more of the air bubbles are preserved in the dough, and you'll get a little bit more of an airy crust. So depending on what kind of crust you prefer, you could do it either way. It's nice, and I know this recipe that's posted doesn't have all this information, right? But if you go to the website, you'll see all of this in the recipe. And so you can, when you go to bake it, I just have a baking pan that I've lined with parchment paper. You could also use, like if you have a pizza pan, you could do that as well. So it says that if you use parchment paper, it produces a softer bottom crust, but it makes cleanup really easy, right? You just get to take the paper and throw it away. But if you wanted a crispier bottom, you could use like a perforated pizza pan or a preheated pizza stone if you have any of those. But you might want to dust it with like flour or cornmeal under the dough so it doesn't stick to the pan. So those are some fun facts. Again, I just liked this recipe, and I think I've tried it before, but it's been a few years. And I don't have a huge pizza dough preference. I like lots of different pizza. So we've got 30 seconds left on our timer. So then we'll just hand stretch it. We'll put it on our pan, and then we will top it with whatever we want. I'm using just normal red pasta sauce. If you have pizza sauce, I know a lot of the times they can seem relatively interchangeable. I don't know what the main difference is. You could use either, or you could use like pesto, or there's lots of different variations. Barbecue pizza, you can top it with whatever you want. So many possibilities. Okay, So it's been 5 minutes. We've let it sit. I'm gonna just move these things. We'll wipe this just a little bit so I can set my pan right here. Alright, so you don't want the crust to get like more than a 1/4 inch thin. So I'm going to flour my hands just a little bit so it doesn't stick so much to my hands. Running a little bit low on my flour. Alright. And if you have like I think they call them like a bench scraper, that's a good way to sort of get this up off of the surface that you've kneaded it on, whether that's an island or a table or your countertop. So then we're just gonna, it's pretty easy, this dough is pretty malleable, so we're just gonna hand stretch it. So you can, you know, if you want, kind of do it this way, or you can just put it straight onto your, ooh, it is a little bit sticky. I'm gonna add some more flour so that it stops being so sticky. And then I'm gonna flour, well, we'll just do it this way. So we're just gonna hand toss it. So I'm just gonna try to make like a circle shape by just kind of pulling it around and around and around. We'll end up putting it on the pan. See, there's already starting to be some holes, but we'll just fill those in. So then we can just kind of put it on the sheet pan with the parchment paper and just sort of spread it out. And so as long as you have an even thickness, that's sort of what you're going for. If you have a rolling pin, you can use it. I don't know. Oh, it's a little bit tricky with the edges of my pan. So I'm going to stuff a little bit. You want to make sure you flour it well. You can put a little bit of flour on top too. The rolling pin will help you get like a more even thickness. It's not going to work well because I already put it on my pan. Not great because the edges of the pan are getting in my way. So I'm just, you know, slowly trying to spread it out. I don't know how big of a circle this is going to be, but I would imagine it's 10 to 12 inches. But just kind of pressing it all around to make sure it's an even-ish thickness. Alright, looks pretty good. I don't know how well you can see it. I'm going to rinse off my hands. And then we'll open up our sauce. So like I said, you can use any sort of toppings or sauce that you want. You could probably use this as like a base if you wanted to make like breadsticks or cheesy bread or something. Sorry, sometimes I don't know how well my computer picks up my voice when I'm not directly in front of it. Alright. So we've got our pasta sauce open. We're just going to ladle it on top. So feel free, if you like lots of sauce, add lots of sauce. If you don't like so much sauce, don't make it too saucy. But just make sure it's like pretty evenly distributed so that some areas don't get too wet because the sauce is too thick. So I'm just trying to evenly spread it around. You could also add some like seasonings if you wanted to the dough, I think, right? Like if you put some granulated garlic or some like Italian seasoning, it might add a nice flavor to the dough. All right. So we have our pasta sauce on there. I'm just gonna make a cheese pizza, nice and easy. Add a little bit of mozzarella in this bag. We'll grab another one. So just a nice, right? Like I know you can make like pita pizzas or like pizza bagels, but if you do want more of a traditional style pizza, this seems like a nice way to easily make it. I know it took a little bit longer than we might have expected because the dough was not cooperating, but sometimes it happens. Alright. I obviously like a lot of cheese on my pizza. So, alright. We got it. Let me show you because this little lip. There we go. So we're just going to toss this in the oven for 15 minutes. It'll feel like no time to you, but it'll be 15 minutes and then we'll be done. Alright everyone, we're back. It seemed to cook pretty well in the oven. I did leave it in for the full 15 minutes. And like I mentioned on the website, the crust doesn't get like it doesn't really brown on the bottom, but it looks like it's cooked through. At least for me, I like my pizza a little bit on the doughier side than on the like super crispy side. So if you're like that, you could always pull it out a couple of minutes before. If you like it crispier, you can leave it in a little bit longer. This is what it looks like. Not necessarily the most beautiful, but I think it'll taste delicious. So the nice thing about the parchment paper is that I was easily able to transfer it onto a cutting board. Great, and so this allows me, if you have a pizza cutter, you can cut it. If you have a knife, you can easily cut it. Right, so this just allows me to easily cut through. And then we'll show you what a piece looks like. It's still pretty hot, so I won't eat it at the moment, but see, nice cheese pull. Yeah, but it's hot. Looks pretty cooked through. Again, it'll be a little bit different than what you might be used to with a yeasted dough. But if you try it, let me know. I would recommend, based on what you saw today, to add less water initially. You don't want it to be so sticky on your hands. You want it to have enough flour where it doesn't stick so much so you're able to shape it and form it. So I would use less water, maybe start with like half a cup and add more as you need. But that's the nice thing about dough is that it can balance out, especially with this being so simple. It can balance with like adding more flour versus adding more water to get to the texture that you need. Well, thank you so much for joining. Again, if you have any suggestions on things we should be making in the future, please email UM-Dearborn Pantry at umich.edu. If you have any ideas, so ideally, right, like we'll have multiple people who might be hosting the cooking show, so it's not just me. If you have a fun name that you can think of, so it's not just Cooking with Colbath, it's a little bit more broad, right, because we had Tyler 7 one time, so if there's some sort of play on cooking, please let us know. We're looking to potentially rebrand a little bit. If you have any questions, email UM-Dearborn Pantry, and we'll see you next time. Bye, y'all.